Well, good morning. As we start this Advent season, we're going to be in a series called Christmas Feels. And we're going to be talking about some of the emotions that are kind of surrounding Christmas and kind of what it feels like. And we're going to be looking at some specific people in the Christmas story and how they reacted and some of the things that they felt and how that affects us and applies to us today. But as we get started, I want everybody to think of what are some of your favorite Christmas traditions? What are some of your favorite things? Like, it's not Christmas unless this happens. For almost all of us, there's something that comes to mind where we're like, it's not Christmas until this happens, or until we open presents, or sometimes it's until we have this meal. But the reality is that the more we have these traditions and the more we like them, a lot of them have become something that we do out of habit. And while we really do like some of them, and it's not Christmas until certain things happen, the other things that are traditions that we don't really know how they started. We just kind of do them and just kind of go through the motions because that's what we do at Christmas. And things can become kind of mundane around Christmas because it's the same thing every year, and we read the same stories every year. So sometimes it can feel a little bit mundane. And today we're going to be in Luke chapter 1, and we're going to be looking at the priest Zechariah. And Zechariah was a priest, so in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, Luke wrote that in the time of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commandments and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. So Zechariah was a priest, and he was on duty, and this was something that had been going on for 400 years. Because the last time that there was a prophet from God, the last time that the people of Israel had heard from God was 400 years ago from the prophet Malachi. And one of the last things that Malachi told them was that God would be sending another prophet like Elijah who's going to turn people back to God. And so for 400 years, the Israelites were waiting for Elijah to return so that the Messiah could come. And a lot had happened in this 400 years. Alexander the Great had come through and conquered much of the area, and so everybody was speaking Greek. And then the Romans came in and conquered Israel. So there was one government. And the spiritual leaders, because there was 400 years of not hearing from God, the spiritual leaders had just fallen into tradition. They just started following tradition, just doing things because that's the way they've always done it. Doing things because that's the way that they were taught to do it. And generation after generation this happened. And then the Romans, when they came in, they didn't want Israel to have their own king, so they appointed a king over Israel. And that was Herod the Great, and Herod was loyal to Rome. And so a lot had happened in 400 years. There were just generation after generation of people going through the traditions and waiting for the Messiah to come. And that's when Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were just going through their normal duties. And Zechariah was a priest, and he was getting ready to just go through his normal duties. And that's what happens in verses 8 through 10. When Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as a priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time came of the burning of incense, all assembled worshipers were praying outside. And so the burning of incense was something that the priests would do every day, twice a day. But they were chosen by lot, and so it was decided that Zechariah would go. And he was probably thinking this was going to be the big deal for him, because the priest to go into the temple and burn incense was something that each priest only did one time in their life. So he was chosen to do this once-in-a-lifetime thing. It was a huge honor, and he was probably thinking, this is the biggest thing that's probably going to happen to me. This is the biggest day that I'm ever going to experience, because he had gone through his life. Him and his wife Elizabeth were fairly old, and they didn't have children. And in Israel at this time, if an old couple had never had children, especially if they didn't have a son, it was seen as a curse from the Lord, or maybe God wasn't giving them children because they weren't living blameless lives, that they were doing something wrong that God was punishing them for. Because children weren't just continuing on the family. Children were the welfare for people. Instead of having retirement, they just lived with their family. And so if you didn't have children, then there was going to be nobody to take care of you when you were old. If you didn't have children, they thought that this meant you were cursed from God. But Luke made sure to point out that Zechariah and Elizabeth, though they were childless, they were blameless. Because Luke wanted to make sure that everybody who read this knew that they weren't cursed by God, that they were doing and living the life that God wanted them to live, but yet they were childless. And so they were just going through the mundane, the day after day. And we realize that this is where a lot of times God chooses to meet us. God chooses to meet us in the mundane as we're going through our day-to-day lives. Moses was a shepherd, and he was just doing his shepherd duties and going through his day after day, watching the sheep, tending the sheep, when he saw the burning bush and met God. And David was also a shepherd, and he was caring for sheep when God called him to go and fight Goliath. And Gideon was threshing wheat, and Peter and many of the disciples were mending nets and fishing when Jesus called them. Because God often chooses to meet us in the mundane. And he does this because he doesn't want just our big moments. He wants our small moments too. He wants our day-to-day lives. He doesn't want to meet us just on Sunday mornings or on Christmas or Easter. He wants to be with us and have a relationship with us and meet us every day. And that's what happened to Zechariah. He met God in the mundane. He was going through his day-to-day life, his day-to-day job. And that's when he met God, and that's when Gabriel appeared to Zechariah. And that's recorded in verses 11 through 21. So then the angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been answered. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and a delight for you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even before he is born. He will bring back many people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of parents to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, and to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." And Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." And the angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. So Zechariah was in the temple, doing what he was supposed to do. And then all of a sudden, Gabriel appeared before him and told him this great news that his prayers have been heard. Not only his prayers to have a son, to have children in their old age, but also prayers that the Messiah was coming. Because for 400 years, the priests had been waiting and praying for the Messiah to come, praying for the people to be delivered. Gabriel appeared to Zechariah and told him that their prayers had been heard. But the first thing that Gabriel says to him is to fear not. And this is a statement that's repeated lots of times in the Gospel of Luke, but all the Gospels, and almost any time an angel appears, the first thing they say is fear not. Because Gabriel was this angel that just suddenly appeared, and so Zechariah was gripped with fear. And then Gabriel instructed Zechariah to name his son John. And John means Jehovah is gracious. John means that God is gracious and that their prayers have been answered. And Zechariah, when this all happened, when Gabriel suddenly appeared before him, he responded not with faith, but with doubt. He had grown up and studied all his life the Old Testament scriptures, and hearing the story and knowing the story and telling the story of Abraham and Sarah and about how they had a child in their old age. But when Zechariah heard the same message, he doubted. And it's really easy for us to say that if we had been in that situation, we wouldn't have doubted. Because I'm sure Zechariah, after 400 years of not hearing from the Lord, but looking and studying the Israelites, probably had a lot of those same thoughts that if I had seen what they had seen, I would have responded with faith and not doubted. But Zechariah, when Gabriel appeared before him and told him what was going to happen, he still doubted. And Zechariah, what he was really questioning was he was questioning God's ability to be faithful to keep his own word. And so Gabriel told him that because you didn't respond with faith, you're not going to be able to speak until these things come true. So Zechariah doubted because he had heard stories about what God had been doing, heard stories about the Israelites being delivered, but he still doubted. Because for 400 years, the priests were going through the motions. They were following tradition. They were going through the mundane. And when we do this for long periods of time, in the mundane, we tend to make God safe. We tend to make God safe, and we know the stories, but we think that that's not going to happen today. Because we tend to make God safe. We tend to put him in a box. And so we might think that it was easier for the Israelites to fear the Lord because they saw so much power and so much might. The Israelites, they saw him deliver them from Egypt. They saw him part the Red Sea. They saw him bring manna and meet their daily needs. But then they still doubted. Even though they saw God part the Red Sea, when they got to Mount Sinai, the Israelites thought that God abandoned them. So they built a golden calf. And they saw God bring the plagues on Egypt. But they didn't think that God would deliver the Philistines to them and deliver the promised land to them. They saw God bring manna and water. But as they were wandering through the wilderness, they complained. And Zechariah heard these stories, knew these stories the same way we do, probably even more than we did. And he probably thought a lot of the same things that we think, that if we had seen those things, we would have responded with faith and not doubted. But in the mundane, we tend to make God safe. And one thing that the Israelites were missing one thing that they didn't believe about God is they might have understood his power, but they didn't believe he is good. Because God isn't safe, but he is good. And that's one thing that the Israelites were missing. They understood that God isn't safe. They saw the power and the miraculous things that he could do. But they didn't put their faith in him. They didn't believe that he is good, that he cared about them. In C.S. Lewis's The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, one of the characters, Mr. Beaver, is talking to the 4 children, and he tells Susan that Aslan, the ruler of Narnia, is a great lion. And Susan is surprised because she thought that Aslan, the king, would be a human. But when she finds this out, she tells Mr. Beaver, I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. And then she asked, is Aslan safe? To which Mr. Beaver replies, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. He's a lion. But he is good. He's the king. And so the Israelites, they were meant to fear God in a different way. While all the gods around them and the people worshiping the gods feared gods out of fear that if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, if they didn't offer the sacrifices, then their gods would retaliate against them. But the Israelites were meant to fear God in a different way. Because while they saw God's power and understood that he could do anything he wanted, that he had control over everyone and everything, they also had to understand that he is good. And the Greek word for fear used here in Luke 1, the Greek word for fear used when we're talking about fearing God is the word phobos. And it's used a couple of times in Luke chapter 1. First time is when Zechariah has fear because Gabriel appeared. But the second time it happens is in verses 57 through 66. And so, when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, no, he is to be called John. And they said to her, there is no one among your relatives who has that name. And they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. After he asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, his name is John. Immediately, his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about these things. Everybody who heard this wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. And so the Greek word phobos that Luke first used when Zechariah saw Gabriel and Zechariah feared him is the same word that he used when describing the people's reaction to hearing Zechariah speak for the first time. It says they were filled with awe. And the word for awe is also phobos, because phobos can mean to fear and be scared of, but it can also mean to have reverence or awe. And so they're filled with awe. They were filled with phobos at seeing Zechariah speak again. And so Zechariah went from the mundane, and then he was filled with phobos. He was filled with awe. And I think a lot of us around Christmas time, it has become something that's mundane. It's something that happens every year. We get busy Christmas shopping, trying to make time and meet with friends and family, and just go through the Christmas traditions that we lose a lot of the awe around Christmas. Because we read the same story every year about the shepherds and the angels and the wise men. And we It's the same passage, the same story. And we read it over and over. And sometimes I think if we admit it, we get bored with the story. We get bored with Jesus. But this doesn't say anything about the magnificence of God. It says everything about us and where our heart's at. Because awe and wonder belong only to those who notice the miracles around them, who notice how Jesus is working and how Jesus wants to be part of our everyday. And so God's blessing was resting abundantly on Zacharias and Elizabeth because they had the son that they'd been praying for. They lived blamelessly, but they were childless. But now they were blamelessly with the child. And so John not only showed that the Messiah was coming, that he was going to do great things, but that God's blessing was on them. That's something that the Israelites would have understood. And Zechariah, when he first begins to speak, the first thing he does is praise God. The first thing he does is praise God, not just because he had a son, but because he understood that God was working through his son, that the Spirit was going to be filled in his son. So he saw John and praised God because God was working. And when he could speak again, he wasn't praising God because he could speak again. He was praising God because he knew that it was God's power that held his tongue for 9 months, and it was God's power that allowed him to speak again. He was praising God because he was filled with awe and wonder at who God is. So Zechariah looked to God for awe and wonder. Zechariah wasn't filled with wonder just because of the things happening around him, but because he saw God working in them. And St. Gregory of Nyssa was talking about Jesus, what he was doing and who he was. And he was filled with awe and wonder at the character of God and what he did. And he said, the very Son of God, older than the ages, the invisible, the incomprehensible, the incorporeal, the beginning of beginning, the light of light, the fountain of life and immortality, the image of the archetype, the immovable seal, the perfect likeness, the definition of the word of the Father. That is who Jesus is when Jesus was born. He needed all of those words and much more to try and grasp the idea of who Jesus is when he was born as a baby. Who Jesus is and how everything that Jesus is was, he gave up so much for us to be born as a baby and be held in the arms of Mary. And so at Christmas, as we're going through the mundane, we can find wonder by looking to God. And so the bottom line today is that looking at Jesus takes us from the mundane and the safe to awe and wonder. See, we wait in eager and confident expectation for the greatest miracle of all. The miracle of Jesus, the Word made flesh. Because Jesus is fully God, but he chose to be born as a helpless baby, to be fully human, to walk alongside us, to live the same lives that we're living, but then to give himself as a living sacrifice to save us so that we could be with him forever. And so the gospel opens with an amazing account of the Lord's plan unfolding. Zechariah and Elizabeth were welcoming a child, and the seemingly impossible was made possible. Their son that they thought was impossible, but God made possible, was preparing the way for the Messiah to come. But he was also preparing the way for something even greater and more impossible to happen: the saving of humanity. And this was even greater than anything that they'd expected or what they'd been waiting hundreds of years for, because they knew that the Messiah was coming. And that's what we're remembering at Advent, that Jesus came. He wasn't just the Messiah of Israel. He's our Messiah. He didn't just deliver Israel. He delivered us. And so this Christmas, as we're going through the traditions that might feel mundane, look for God in them so we can be filled with awe and wonder.